All right, the human mind. Yogi Berra's famous quote, 90% of this game is half mental. But Yogi was not far from the truth. 90% of this game is half mental. Because businesses are built by people, by human beings. Our customers are human beings, our employers are human beings, our contractors are human beings. Everybody that we work with, aside from the raw physics of raw materials and systems and processes and mechanical things, almost all of business deals with people. And so understanding how people think and act, and tend to think and tend to act, is enormously beneficial when you're running a business, because it helps you understand how you're dealing with a particular business situation that you may be dealing with. So it helps you manage yourself better. It also helps you anticipate how your customers will react to a change, how your employees will react to a change, how anybody remotely associated with your business will probably respond if you do something particular. And by having an accurate understanding of that, it's far easier to make better decisions about what to do. So that's why we're going to talk so much about the human mind. Understanding the fundamentals of human psychology allows us to work better with ourselves and to work better with other folks.
The human mind. Questions for reflection. How much do you understand about how the human mind works? How can learning more about human psychology help you with your work?
Now, the first thing to understand about human psychology is what I call caveman syndrome. And the idea here is human biology is optimized for a world that existed 100,000 years ago and does not exist today. So we are biologically optimized to hunt for food, to protect ourselves from predators, to find attractive mates, and to, in general, keep ourselves alive long enough to have children, period. Biologically, that is it. We are not biologically optimized to do discounted cash flow valuation models. So we've talked about a couple times how the human mind just doesn't intuitively multiply things well. This is why, biologically, we've never had to. It was almost incidental that we are capable of doing it in the first place. So the first lesson of psychology as applied to business is we should cut ourselves a serious amount of slack when it comes to this stuff. Because sometimes these things feel hard because they are hard for us. And the analogy I like to use is we are doing the psychological equivalent of running brand new, just developed, very advanced software on the most ancient computer that you could ever think of. Some of these things are just difficult for us to intuitively do. So the first part of understanding human psychology applied to business is to have a lot of compassion for ourselves. We're trying to do things that are difficult for us, and that's okay. Because by understanding the ways in which our psychology tends to malfunction in certain ways, or tends to make some things more preferential than other things, we can start to build in systems that help us compensate for that.
Caveman syndrome. Questions for reflection. Do you often feel bad about not being able to keep up with the demands of modern life? How does knowing we're not built for what we're doing change the way you perceive your shortcomings?
This is an idea called the gas tank. As a human being, you are a biological entity. And as a biological entity, you need certain things in order to function. You need food, you need water, you need air, you need to maintain your temperature at a certain rate, you need exercise, you need stimulation. You need a bunch of things on a day-to-day basis that have nothing to do with your profit and loss numbers at all. And just like a car has a gas tank, you have a gas tank too. Whenever any one of those factors becomes too low, you're gonna start to feel a little run down. You start to feel a little angry or a little anxious, or there will be some biological signal that your body will send you saying, hey, something is up here. I'm not getting enough of what I need. So doing some things like making sure you're eating well, making sure you're getting enough sleep, making sure you're getting enough exercise, are not optional things when it comes to you or any of the people you work with in the practice of business. If you don't get enough of them, your performance will suffer. It's not a matter of might, it's a matter of will. And as a result, and I think this is something that is a very modern tendency, we tend to place our work first. And then if we have time, we might eat something. Or if we have time, we might go out for a walk. Or if we have time, the biological considerations come last. Biologically speaking, you need to put them first, or your business is going to suffer. And there are all sorts of things, experiments you can do to figure out just how much of these things you need to be happy and healthy. But doing them is not an option. It's mandatory.
The gas tank. Questions for reflection. How are you treating your body? Are all of your physical needs being met? What can you do to make taking care of your physical, mental, and emotional health your top priority?
Now, in understanding how the human mind works, this is a way oversimplified model, but it helps. So our mind, our brain, what allows us to perceive and interact with the world around us, developed in layers over a very long period of time. And at the risk of huge oversimplification, the layers develop one over top of the other. So at the core of our brain, down towards the brainstem, is a group of structures called the hindbrain. And you can think of the hindbrain as the part of our brain that keeps us biologically alive. Regulates our heartbeat, regulates our breathing, regulates our temperature, our reflexes. All of those things we need to do to perceive the world and react to it very quickly, and to maintain the homeostasis in our body. Seth Godin calls this the lizard brain. That is the sole function, it's to keep you alive. Just over top of that is a group of structures called the midbrain. And this area of your brain is responsible for things like sensory input and pattern matching and doing all the things to try to anticipate what's going to happen next in the environment and prepare for it. So things like emotion are all midbrain centered type of thing. Most of our mind is taken up in the midbrain in terms of functions. Above the midbrain, developed very recently, is a set of structures called the forebrain. And these are things that we would think of traditionally, things that make us human. Things like language and logic and mathematics. And all of these higher level cognitive processes, developmentally speaking, are extremely new. We haven't had them very long. And one of the reasons we developed them in the first place, as the theory goes, is sometimes it's not immediately apparent in the environment what we should do. So something is new to us, or we can't rely on an old pattern, or we can't rely on an instant reflex. We have to take a look at the situation, collect some information, and there has to be a decision-making part of the brain that resolves that ambiguity. It's what our forebrain is designed to do. Now, it's important to understand that when there's a conflict between the logical, rational, decision-making parts of our brain and either the survival or the emotional and the pattern matching recognition parts of our brain, hindbrain and midbrain are always going to win. They have a lower level of access. So if you've ever been in a situation where logically, rationally, think of a sunk cost situation. I know I shouldn't invest any more in this because it's probably not going to pay out. But darned if it doesn't feel like the wrong thing to do. There can be conflicts between the different parts of your mind. You don't have a unified mind, you have all sorts of different minds all working in parallel all at the same time. So one of the very best things that you can do in terms of your health and sanity, just in life in general, is, does anyone have the experience of having like the equivalent of a radio announcer in their mind? Like you're going through life and parts of your brain are like making little comments on things or noticing things. There's this chatter that's happening all the time. And a lot of people associate themselves, their identity, with that radio announcer in their brain. And that can be very maddening sometimes, because sometimes the announcer's saying all sorts of different things that are mutually contradictory and you may know you may not want to do, and it just gets very overwhelming very quickly. What this model of the mind tells us is that that's not you, that's just a part of your brain that's responsible for noticing those things, alerting you to the presence of something you should pay attention to in the environment. That's it. It's a data stream. And you can either choose to take advantage of those things in that stream, or you can just let the chatter pass, because that's exactly what it is. It's chatter. So in terms of a personal practice type of thing, and a generalizable practice, things like meditation, which is basically listening to that chattering going on in your head and not associating yourself with it, or actively trying to calm that down a little bit, can be hugely beneficial, because it helps you separate the decision-making part of you from the parts of your brain that are just chattering. Takes practice. And it's funny, I've heard meditation described as sitting down to do something that you know in advance you're going to be horrible at it. Because biologically, we're designed to be horrible at it. But the practice of sitting down and practicing not identifying with that voice, you get better and better and better at taking the good stuff that it's giving you and ignoring the things that aren't relevant or aren't useful. Doesn't take very long, it's very useful.
The onion brain. Questions for reflection. What is the radio announcer in your head saying? How can you take time to quiet your mind and simply watch what happens?
Now, perceptual control is a grand theory of human behavior. Why people behave in the ways that they behave. And the grand unified theory of human behavior that most of us, if we were exposed to it at all, grew up with, was some variant of what was called behaviorism. A stimulus response type of thing. So something stimulates a person in the environment, and that produces a response. In goes the input, out goes the output. And lots of different variations of this idea. Perceptual control theory was actually first formulated by a physicist. His name was William T. Powers. And he actually was working in a very interesting area called control systems. So think of a house and a thermostat and a heating and cooling system that's designed to keep the house at the same temperature. Now, the temperature outside the house can fluctuate wildly, and the thermostat inside the house doesn't have access to any of that information. It doesn't know what's going on. But when the temperature dips below a certain threshold, the thermostat kicks the heater on to bring the temperature back up. When the temperature is above a certain threshold, the air conditioner kicks on and brings it back down to a stable level. So if you look at the behavior of that system, it's really intelligently managing the temperature at a very steady internal state, even though the outside temperature may be fluctuating wildly. So what William T. Powers noticed is that there are systems in our bodies and in our minds that work roughly in the same way. If something within ourselves, so think of a simple system in our body like regulating blood sugar. So if your blood glucose level is too high, that's a life-threatening condition. If it's too low, that's a life-threatening condition too. So your body has evolved a feedback mechanism when, if it notices too high, insulin is released and the sugar is absorbed into the cells to bring it back down. When your blood sugar is low, the opposite happens and the sugar is released back into your bloodstream. So as a result, your blood glucose level is pretty much the same almost all the time. There's a feedback loop there. The same thing happens when you go up higher levels of human behavior. So take, for example, there is a certain amount of light that is comfortable to hit the retinas of your eyes. When the amount of light hitting your retinas is too low, you notice because you can't see anything around you. So, if it's too low, you are going to do the things that you need to do based on what's available in your environment to bring the amount of light hitting your retina back up to the point where you can see something. And that could be a number of things. You could use a flashlight, you can turn a light switch, you can open the blinds on the windows. Doesn't matter what you do, what you're trying to do is control the perception, which is the amount of light hitting your retina. Now, the reverse is true, right? So if there's too much light hitting your retina, you're going to do things that reduce that. You might shield your eyes, you may pull down the blind, you may put on sunglasses, and the behavior you choose to exhibit is completely dependent on what's available in the environment around you, right? There's no set response for that. But what prompts you to action is some perception that is out of control in some important respect. And this is one of those ideas that takes just a little while to wrap your mind around and to start thinking about all of human behavior as starting when some important perception is out of whack. And nothing happens until it's out of whack, and nothing will happen until it's out of whack. But once you start thinking in terms of perceptual control, you start seeing why people either are doing or don't do the types of things that they do. Has anyone ever had the experience of everything is great, you're making enough money, your projects are manageable, everything's great at home, and you just really don't feel like doing much anything? Kind of have a lazy period, right? That is one of those things that perceptual control theory predicts rather well. If nothing is out of control, there's nothing for you to change in your environment to bring anything back under control. What perceptual control theory also predicts is that the moment something goes out of control or feels out of control, all of a sudden you're going to start doing things in order to come back under control. We will talk about working with yourself, the process of goal setting. You can think of goal setting in terms of perceptual control theory. Goal setting is the process of intentionally setting yourself out of control in some important area of your life. And by setting yourself out of control, you automatically start doing the things that are available in your environment to start bringing yourself back to a state of bringing it under control. And that could look like a couple things. It could be taking actions that actually lead to more of what you want, or it could be desetting the goal so now you're back under control. So this is one of those fundamental things about how people work that takes a while to understand. But once you grasp it, you can start making lots of predictions about why you're doing what you're doing.
Perceptual control. Questions for reflection. Are you treating people as control systems or stimulus response machines? How can you discover what people are controlling for, then help them get it?
A couple of add-ons to perceptual control theory. So a perceptual control theory system relies on a perception that is trying to be controlled. That's the center, it's the thermostat. The acceptable values for that perception are called reference levels. So in the thermostat example we were talking about earlier, there was a range of acceptable temperatures in which it was acceptable for the house to be, right? As long as the temperature was between those points, the heating and cooling system did nothing. That's the reference level. When the reference level is broken, when the perception falls below or above that range, that's where the action occurs. And those reference levels can take on all sorts of different forms. So first is what we talked about, a range of acceptable values. The second is a set point. It has to be a certain amount or it's out of whack. So something like your blood glucose level, there is a set point there. It needs to be at an optimum or the system's going to adjust either way. And the third is what you can call an error. It has to be nothing or something is out of whack. So think of the pain receptors in your skin. Most of the time they're doing nothing. When you get a signal from one of them, something is wrong and needs to be addressed. And this is where it gets into the practical part. To change the behavior either of yourself or of somebody else, you either need to change the reference levels that they are paying attention to, which is kind of the entire process of negotiating, right? What is the range of acceptable values you are willing to accept in exchange for the value I'm providing? Negotiating is the process of helping them change their reference levels and your reference levels. Or you have to change the environment. And we'll talk about a very important idea called guiding structure about if you want to change your behavior or the behavior of anyone else, you don't act on them directly, you change the environment around yourself or around them. And the behavior automatically changes with that. So this is the theory that's going to lead to a lot of the practical things that we talk about in working with yourself and working with others. And that's a fundamental aspect of human nature. We like to be able to control things, but we don't have access privileges over the control systems of others. So we can control our behavior, we can control our responses to the things that are out of control in our life, but we can't control that for other people. What we can do is influence their reference levels by talking to them, by presenting information, by presenting options. We can do things that may affect how they choose to resolve those levels, or we can change the environment around them to either increase or decrease the probability that they're going to resolve a conflict in a particular way.
Reference level. Questions for reflection. What constitutes the normal reference levels for the system you're examining, and how do you know when things are out of control? Are these reference levels a range of values, a set point, or an error?
Now, conservation of energy is essentially what happens in a control system when everything's under control. If nothing is out of control, we've evolved to avoid expending energy unless it's absolutely necessary. If our ancient ancestors had dance parties every moment of every day, and they were exhausted when a lion came, that's not real great, right? So conserving energy is, unless there's a real reason, unless something is out of control, we tend to conserve our energy. We're not going to exert ourselves until a reference level is violated. And when it is, that's when we kick into action. So sources of information that change your reference levels are valuable in prompting action. Good example of this is, let's say a new issue of Inc. magazine comes out. Dan reads it. There's a guy who's doing exactly what Dan is doing and is making $42 billion. And Dan would really love to do what he's doing and make $42 billion. And he starts to get really ticked off that he's not the guy who's making $42 billion. Objectively, before reading that magazine article, Dan is in the same situation after reading the article as he was before. Nothing has changed externally. His bank account balance is still the same. Internally, his reference level of what's possible in his industry has just changed dramatically. And as a result, the actions that he's going to take are going to change dramatically. In many cases, all you need to know is that something is possible. And if you want that thing, you start working towards making that thing a reality in your life. You just need to know it's possible first, or else you're not going to do it. So if you can't imagine a future in which it's possible to earn $42 billion doing what you're doing, you're not going to work to earn $42 billion doing what you're doing.
Conservation of energy. Questions for reflection. Are you being lazy, or is it more likely you're conserving energy? How could you intentionally knock a reference level out of control to prompt action in a certain area of your life?
So this perceptual control system talk leads us into a very useful technique for pretty much everything when it comes to changing human behavior, and that is called guiding structure. So guiding structure says that the structure of your environment is the single largest determinant of your behavior. So the example that we used, if there's too much light hitting your retina, you are going to do something. The something that you do is largely going to be dependent on the options that are at your disposal when you're trying to fix the thing. So you can fix the situation by putting on sunglasses, but if you don't have sunglasses, you can't put them on. So the structure of the environment changes your behavior. You may pull down a shade on a window instead. So if you want to successfully change a behavior, change the structure of your environment that is involved in that behavior, and your behavior will change automatically. A good tangible example of this is a couple of years ago when Kelsey and I moved to New York City, we decided we wanted to try living on a vegan diet for a number of years. And we talked to a lot of our friends, and they said things like, "Oh my gosh, I could never do that. You guys must have just amazing willpower because I love hamburgers so much I could just not help myself from getting hamburger." And the truth is, it was a really easy change to make. We decided once, we changed a couple of things, and voila, we were vegan, and we stayed that way for 3 years. The first thing that we did is throw out all of the things that we no longer wanted to eat, because if they weren't in our apartment, we couldn't eat them. Number two, we changed where we shopped. So there was a shop relatively close by, which was one of the reasons we picked the apartment where we picked our apartment. There was a shop close by that was really easy to shop vegan, and we didn't have the temptation of walking past the meat counter and having to resist buying hamburgers and steaks. That was it. 2 things. And as a result, our behavior changed and we barely even thought about it, because we just changed the structure of the environment around us. So you can do the same thing with pretty much any behavioral change you want to make. Either stopping doing something by removing it from your environment, or starting doing something because it is now in your environment. So an example on the positive side is that I decided I wanted to get in shape. And one of the things I always wanted to be able to do is those bars that you can do dips on. I always thought that was the coolest thing. And I grew up a pretty skinny kid and I could never even do once. Like, man, that would be really cool if I could do that. And so I got a little bar that sits in a central location in my office. And when I'm walking past it, I'll take a couple moments and I'll do a couple. Because it's there, it's easy to do. I almost run into the thing a couple times a day. By virtue of having it in my environment, I can now do 15 or 16 in a row just because I started doing it because it's now there. So there are all sorts of things if you want to either start doing something or stop doing something. Don't try to willpower your way through it. We'll talk about an idea called willpower depletion here in a moment. We only have so much willpower to go around. And if it's true we only have so much willpower to go around, you might as well invest that willpower in the very most intelligent way possible. And that's by making a decision once to change your environment permanently, and all of your behavior after that will change itself. And part of that, in terms of the environment, which we'll talk about in great detail in systems, is making it easier or harder to do things. So taking away some friction. So my dip bar example was taking away the friction of doing dips because I bumped into it, it was right next to me. It was very easy to just say, I might as well do a couple while I'm here. Whereas adding some friction to things that you don't want to do makes it more difficult to do it. And if it's more difficult, it may require more energy than your biological and mental systems are willing to invest in doing that thing. So you don't do it. So guiding structure as a technique, as you can see, you can apply it to pretty much anything. It's amazing. And this is business, this is personal, whether you want to start doing something or stop doing something. You're always going to get a better bang for your buck if you change the environment first instead of trying to willpower through stuff.
Guiding structure. Questions for reflection. How is your current environment affecting your behavior? How can you change the structure of your environment to make it easier to do what you want to do?
Another idea related to perceptual control is called reorganization. And reorganization is random action that occurs when a reference level is violated, but you don't have a pre-existing pattern in your mind about how to resolve it. So something is wrong, but I don't know what to do. And when that happens, this is when people feel this really angsty quarter-life or midlife crisis, or the whole I don't know what my purpose on this earth is. It's all of these really deep emotional experiences where people feel bound up, either in a big way, or maybe it's you're standing in the middle of the supermarket and it's I don't know what brand of cereal to buy. Or it's something you've never purchased before and there are all sorts of different options, I have no idea what to do. Your mind has a built-in mechanism to help you resolve that, and that's called reorganization. And reorganization is basically just trying random stuff. So the person who has a midlife crisis and buys a Harley and rides across the country, that's a large-scale example of reorganization. Something is wrong, something is out of control, I don't know what, so the brain spits out some random thing, because trying random things ultimately is going to help you learn things that's going to ultimately lead to that conflict being brought back under control. So you can think of reorganization, it's not abnormal, there's nothing wrong with you. Reorganization is the neurological basis of learning. If you don't know what to do, doing something is going to give you more information than doing nothing. So your brain just starts spitting out random stuff to do. And the lesson here is not to fight it and to be able to mentally label this organization and it's normal and I'm not going crazy and everything is going to be okay. My brain is just trying to get more information about this. Because if you don't fight it and you actually try some of the random stuff, you will learn a few things. So once you bring whatever was out of control under control, So you discover what it is and you find some way to bring yourself back into that balance point. The reorganization will stop naturally. It's just something that your brain will do when it doesn't know what to do. And that's okay. There's actually a wonderful book by William T. Powers called Making Sense of Behavior that goes through a lot of this very basic perceptual control theory stuff. The behavioristic stimulus response thing is implicit in so many of the ways that we talk about behavior because it's been around for so long that it's almost the default way that we think about things. And really, truly grokking perceptual control theory requires you to kind of throw that out and adopt an entirely new underlying system of why people do what they do. So it does take a little bit of time. The benefit is once you adopt it, you're able to use it to make more accurate predictions about what people do. A good example of this is, think of a classic business stimulus like, I want my employees to work more, so you do what? Say they're hourly employees.
Give them overtime.
Overtime, perfect. I want my employees to work more, therefore I am going to provide a stimulus, which is more money for work, therefore the response is going to be they are going to work more. What happens in practice?
It's going to vary from person to person, first of all,
Yeah.
because they all have different drivers. Some people will, if they're motivated, if that's their carrot. Others, it's going to take their job that they have to do and just take them longer to do it.
Yep.
Others, if it depends if you do it right, they can work less time and actually get the same amount of
money.
results.
So what do?
They stretch it out.
They stretch it out,
It has
or
their criteria.
yeah, it takes them less time to work to get the amount of money they need, so they actually work less. So you have the same stimulus, which is causing some people to work more, some people to work the exact same amount, and some people to work less. And the behavioristic model doesn't help you predict that very well. And the thing with perceptual control theory, it goes all the way from the biological level, all the way up to what we would think of as philosophical questions like, am I being a good human being? Because people control perceptions that other people have of them, perceptions or qualitative things like, am I being a good spouse? Am I being a good parent? Am I being a good X? And so the individual aspect of it is really understanding as much as you can what each individual person is controlling for and the things that they tend to value most. So if a person is really ambitious, one of the things they're controlling for is more money, giving them the opportunity to work more so they can earn more money is a valuable thing. If you know someone values independence or travel, giving someone a benefit like more vacation time is going to be more beneficial to them, more valuable to them than more money. If you understand that somebody places a high value on spending lots of quality time with their family, you can encourage them by giving them more of what it is that they're actually controlling for.
Have you ever utilized any assessment tools to kind of shorten the learning curve on each individual?
There's actually one assessment that I do use, which is actually the StrengthsFinder assessment. It's very simple, it's very basic, doesn't have anything to do with this. It has more to do with what are you naturally inclined to do well at and enjoy, and are you spending most of your time on doing those things? Because if you're not, you're probably not going to stick around very long and not do very good work. So the short synopsis answer is getting to know the individual on a deeper level helps you understand what they're controlling for and understand what they value, which makes this particular opportunity more attractive to them than anything else that they could be doing.
Reorganization. Questions for reflection. Do you feel like something is wrong but you don't know why or how to fix it? How can you embrace reorganization as a quest to learn more instead of repressing the impulse?
Now, another idea, also related to perceptual control theory, very important, because remember when we were talking about the onion brain, not all of the parts of our mind are going to agree on all things at all times. Sometimes you want two things that are mutually exclusive, or two people want two things that are mutually exclusive, and that's called a conflict. So a conflict occurs when two control systems try to change the same perception. So that's what happens in the typical case of procrastination. So one part of yourself may want to really get this thing done, It's going to be great when it's done. And one part of your mind really wants to take a break because you need to take a break. And when two control systems are trying to fight over the same perception, you get a whole lot of wasted energy, both physically and mentally, and you get a whole lot of nothing done. So think of our thermostat example. If the heater and the air conditioner have two mutually incompatible settings on the thermostat, they're going to be on all the time. The temperature is not going to change very much, or it's going to swing back and forth, and both are burning up energy doing a whole lot of nothing. That's a classic conflict case. The same thing happens when there's conflict between people, right? I want something specific, the other person wants something specific, and we can fight and fight and fight and fight and fight. But unless one person changes their reference levels, or both people adjust their reference levels, or the environment changes as such to make one of those variables change, you're going to exert a lot of energy and not produce a whole lot of output. So what William T. Powers talks about in Making Sense of Behavior is these conflict situations happen all the time. And you can't resolve the conflict at the level that the conflict is existing, right? Because there's a reason there's the conflict. You have to look at why the reference levels are being set the way that they are. So that's another thing of when a conflict occurs, you have to understand the structure in which the conflict is occurring. And then you need to change some aspect of the environment or the system, or at least one level up from that, to resolve the conflict. Otherwise, you're going to burn a lot of energy and not get a whole lot of things done.
Conflict. Questions for reflection. Where are conflicts currently appearing in your life? What control systems are involved, and what are their current reference levels? How can you change the environment to resolve the conflict?
Now, pattern matching. Pattern matching is what our brains are basically designed to do. We do it really well. We do it all the time. So pattern matching is basically trying to define patterns and associating them with things that we have experienced before. And this happens unconsciously. So as we move through life, we notice a lot of the things around us. And our minds have been optimized over a period of hundreds of thousands of years to notice things in the environment and have a limited ability to predict what's going to happen next. So we learn patterns by experimenting. We do a whole bunch of things in the world. We see what's associated with what, and then we know when we do action A, result B is probably going to come from it. The more patterns we have in our memory, the easier it is for us to predict what doing something in the world is ultimately going to result in. So the reason we have a long-term memory, and we have memories in the first place, is recognizing all these patterns that exist in the world, and those are kind of filed back in our memory for later recall. And our minds aren't necessarily optimized for completely accurate recall. Nobody really has a photographic memory. Our minds are optimized for fast recall. So if, for example, you are walking out on the savannah and you see a pair of eyes staring out from the shadows, it doesn't take you 2 minutes to search your mental database for all of the times that you have seen that before. Our brains are designed to bring in the relevant associations and patterns in a fraction of a second, and to make a split-second decision that if that pair of eyes is a lion, will probably save your life, right? That's what it's there to do. So the more accurate patterns that you have collected over the years, the more accurately you can make these predictions. So part of what we're doing here in this masterclass is trying to load your brain with all sorts of potentially relevant patterns for business situations you're probably going to see at some point in the future. And by having the pattern, you can see something that's out there in the world and say, hey, that's risk reversal. And you have a set of things that you can do to respond to that situation quickly or more accurately than you could otherwise.
Pattern matching. Questions for reflection. What patterns have you learned from your past experiences? What could you do to expose yourself to new patterns and information on a daily basis?
Now, related to pattern matching is the idea of mental simulation. And mental simulation is our mind's ability to imagine taking a specific action and simulating the probable result before we ever take action in the first place. So my favorite example of this is, take a second, imagine jumping into an active volcano. Yeah, that's a short one. Why? Yeah, why is it a short one? Yeah, because you incinerate, right? And the thing is, most of us have probably never imagined that specific thing before. We've never thought that thought before. And so instead of taking a couple minutes to collect all the information we know about volcanoes and make some type of rational analysis of whether or not this is really a good idea, the simulation, the visualization is instant and it's all associative. Volcano, fire, hot, incineration, pain, death, no, right? And it's not even that rational or logical, it's just like, no, that's a really bad idea. That's how mental simulation works. We have this database of memories and associations that we have at our disposal, and when we imagine doing something, our brain can make those associations and come up with a split-second response on whether or not something's a good idea. That's what our brains are optimized to do.
Where does impulse control get factored in?
Impulse control is a combination of a couple things. The impulse is a mental simulation about something that may be pleasurable or your mind simulates as a good thing for some reason, but your rational brain may say, that's not exactly what I want to do. So that gets into willpower, which we'll talk about here in a minute. In general, the best way to avoid an impulse is to structure your environment so the situation never presents itself in the first place. So you can't eat the ice cream late at night if the ice cream is not in your refrigerator. So mental simulation really helps us because if we had to actually jump into a volcano to learn that it was a bad idea, that would be a really bad thing, right? So mental simulation has developed in order to make us safe. It allows us to mentally test the consequences of our actions or potential actions based on everything we know about the world without putting ourselves at risk. It's a huge advantage. And it relies on our memory. It relies on all of the patterns that we have developed from birth to today. Now, the interesting thing about mental simulation is that your mind knows where you are right now. So we know all of the things that are in our environment, the types of things that we could do. Without supplying an end state, without supplying a goal, or some action that you might take in the future, you don't mentally simulate anything. It's like a GPS. GPS knows where you are right now. So you tell the GPS where you want to go. Without that end state, the GPS can't give you directions on how to get there. But as soon as you supply that end state, the GPS can calculate where you are now, where you want to go, and the series of things you need to do to get there. That's how mental simulation works. So we're going to talk about, in the Working With Yourself section, a very specific, very powerful technique called a counterfactual simulation that lets you use this consciously to do pretty much anything. But for now, it's important to understand that mental simulation is extremely powerful. It's something we do easily. It's something we do automatically. And if you learn how to use that ability consciously, there's a lot of good that can come from that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit.
Mental simulation. Questions for reflection. How often do you use your imagination to imagine the results or consequences of specific actions or goals? When could you set aside more time for productive mental simulation?
Two related ideas: interpretation and reinterpretation. So when there's not enough information to develop an accurate pattern about the world, the human brain relies on prior information and patterns to make interpretations and fill in the gaps. So this is a biological compensation for the fact that human beings are not omniscient creatures. We don't know everything. We never have all the facts. And sometimes some of the facts that we are missing are really important to accurately reading what's going on in the situation. But instead of shutting down from a lack of information, your mind just makes a cognitive leap. It tries to fill in the gaps that are missing. Happens automatically, happens quickly, we barely even notice it. Physiological fact: there are 2 spots, one in each of your eyes, where you are physiologically blind. There is literally a blind spot in which you cannot see anything. But most of us in our field of vision, when we look out into the world, we see one cohesive picture. Your brain, every second of every day, is taking all of the things that it's seeing around your blind spot and filling in the blanks, and you don't even notice it. It happens automatically, happens instantly. And so it's important to understand that when we are making mental simulations and storing patterns in long-term memory, since we don't have all the facts, our brain has to make these intuitive leaps. And those intuitive leaps get stored into long-term memory. And those intuitive leaps are very often wrong, or at least not the only way that that situation can be interpreted. And this is probably the closest thing that you can ever do or come close to hacking the mental database of your mind, is a process called reinterpretation. So interpretation is happening all the time. You do it unconsciously. But if you interpret a situation in a way that doesn't serve you very well, you can change it. Yes. So a story from me is when I decided to leave brand management at Procter & Gamble, there were multiple ways that I could interpret my experience of going through the company for that approximately 4 years. The first is, and this is an interpretation that was socially supported in some ways, brand management at Procter & Gamble is an up or out culture. You can hack it. If you're successful, you're going to move up the ladder, you're going to be CEO someday, or you're going to fail, you're going to wash out, and you're going to do something that is decidedly less fabulous than being the CEO of Procter & Gamble someday. So if you choose to leave brand management, you are a washout. You are a failure. One way of interpreting the situation. The other way of interpreting the situation is it is possible to work for a couple years in brand management at Procter & Gamble, to learn a lot, to have a lot of good experiences, to work with some interesting people, and then choose to do something else with your life that you find more rewarding. Alternate interpretation. And that single action, the discrete action of choosing to leave a job, it's entirely possible to interpret it in the first manner or interpret it in the second manner. And culturally, the first story is very, very strong, particularly at most large companies that have been around for a really long time. And there was part of me when I was starting to really not enjoy the process of being a brand manager at Procter & Gamble that was very, very likely, or wanted to think along version 1 lines. And it took an active, conscious effort to look at other ways to examine the situation and say, no. I left because I had other opportunities that I was more interested in exploring, and that was the best thing for me. And I took a lot of good stuff, and now I'm doing something else. Great. For me, personally, the second interpretation of that situation serves me much better, because no longer am I a miserable washout failure. I'm a person who did a really smart thing, right? I learned a lot, I gained a lot of great experiences, and now I'm doing something even better than I was doing before. So reinterpretation is also one of those things. It helps to know that it even exists in the first place, right? Because one of the objections that I hear when people learn about interpretation is, well, isn't that lying to yourself? Like, isn't that just telling you a nice story so you feel better? And the important thing is that objection relies on the assumption that your first interpretation of a situation is always the objectively true one. That your first interpretation is an objective fact, and that is not true. Everything is a story. You are always interpreting in some manner. And so if you find yourself coming back to something, an interpretation about your past experience that is not serving you very well, you can actively choose to take a look at it, to re-examine it, to look at the situation and find alternate ways of interpreting it, and choose the one that serves you best. There's a really wonderful book on the personal MBA recommended reading list called Recreate Your Life. It's by a gentleman by the name of Morty Lefko. And he's distilled it to a process, 6 steps, where you're basically finding the pattern, you're replaying it in your mind, you're looking at how you're interpreting it right now, you look at all the other ways that you could potentially reinterpret the situation, and you decide which one of those interpretations would serve you best. And we all have probably hundreds of these things where there are interpretations about things that have happened to us that aren't serving us well and aren't objectively true, but we hang on to them because they were the default. And it's really amazing what happens when you choose to actively reinterpret things. And it can even impact the things that you view as opportunities or threats. I had a client who had a situation where the patterns that he had associated around money, one was a story from childhood where he made the interpretation that money is scarce and must be guarded and is something to be anxious about. And later in life formed the pattern that when money comes, it comes unexpectedly in large amounts from benefactors. And so as a result, these two kind of very conflicting and very specific beliefs about how money works in the world, when he was evaluating business opportunities, guess which ones he gravitated towards? The big risks, the spending 10 years, getting paid nothing on the off chance that you're going to have millions of dollars at the end. And once we were actually working through the reinterpretation process, and it was amazing to see, once he had actually isolated those things and reinterpreted them, he started thinking about things as opportunities that he would never have called opportunities before, because they didn't fit those patterns. So this is the closest thing to mind hacking that we really have. It's going back and seeing how we've interpreted these patterns and then choosing an alternate interpretation that serves us better. It sounds a little self-helpy and woo-woo. This is about the least woo-woo thing that you can do. It requires some effort, but it works.
Interpretation and reinterpretation. Questions for reflection. Do you have any old beliefs or patterns that make you afraid or hesitant to try new things? Are there other ways to interpret past situations in a way that may serve you better?
Now, motivation is one of those things that when we talk about ourselves and our performance and other people's performance, the word tends to be used a lot, and it's helpful to define exactly what we're talking about when we talk about motivation. So motivation is an emotional state that links the parts of our brain that feel with the parts that are responsible for us taking a particular action. And there are two basic desires that spark motivation. So moving towards something desirable or moving away from something that is not desirable. So we feel an emotion. That emotion is we either want to move towards something or move away from something. And that emotion is what connects in our brain to all of the physical ways that we move our body to do the thing that we either want to move towards or away from. Now, motivation is an emotion, not a logical activity. So saying to yourself, man, I should really feel motivated right now, will do nothing. It's an emotional process. There's no automatic component here. Now, when there is a conflict between something you want to move toward and something you want to move away from, the moving away from thing always takes preference for a very simple reason. When you are walking on the savannah, you see eyes in a rustling bush nearby, and you see a bush full of berries that look particularly delicious. From a survival standpoint, the eyes in the bush take precedence over the berries. Because if you stop to eat berries and you get eaten, that's not good, right? So over time, our brains self-optimized through the process of evolution to do things that keep us alive. And things that keep us alive tend to fall into the move away camp. So whenever there's a conflict, we're going to move away from first and move away towards things that we want only when we feel that it's safe to do so. The modern situation we tend to find ourselves in here is, imagine a person who hates their job, has a really horrible boss that yells at them all day, is not happy, and they could resolve that situation by finding a business to start and going off and doing it. How likely is it that they're actually going to do that in the short term? Pretty much no. Because that state of wanting to move away from being very locked down about the situation they're currently in actively shuts down. There's a ton of neurological studies that actually show this. When someone gets scared or anxious about something, there are other parts of the brain that literally shut down from a processing standpoint. I'm going to talk about that later, called threat lockdown. But whenever there's a conflict between the two, we are always going to preference the moving away versus the moving towards. So if we want to get out of that, it helps to say, okay, what do we want to move away from? And what are some ways that I can help alleviate that feeling first? And then let's talk about things that I want to go get. So you almost have to talk yourself off the ledge first and then move towards the things that you want.
Motivation. Questions for reflection. What do you feel drawn toward, and what do you feel the need to move away from? How can you resolve conflicts to eliminate the need to move away from things so you can focus on moving toward what you want?
Now, another psychological component of our mind that's very important to understand is this process called inhibition. And inhibition, so we talked a little bit earlier about impulse control. Inhibition is impulse control. It's our ability to temporarily override our natural inclinations. So it's our ability to say, I really want to eat that ice cream, but I'm going to stop myself from eating the ice cream. A very common phrase, free will, right? We have free will, we can make choices, we have the ability to choose what we act upon and what we don't. The more accurate way of describing that is we don't have free will, we have free won't. Most of the time, we're operating on autopilot. We're sensing things are in our environment that we either want to move towards or away from. We have lots of patterns. We're making mental simulations. We are moving forward without a whole lot of conscious decision making. And our brain pretty much knows what we're going to do next. Until that part of your brain that's responsible for resolving ambiguity and keeping yourself out of trouble sees something that you're about to do and says, no. I'm going to stop doing this thing. That's the inhibitory response. So if you imagine, if you've ever seen a cat hunting a mouse, and the cat is all crouched down and it's about ready to pounce, but it's holding itself back, that's inhibition at work. And that's what we do when we exercise willpower or impulse control. We're keeping ourselves from doing something.
What layer of the brain is that?
That is midbrain / hindbrain. So forebrain says, don't do that, sends a signal to midbrain, which goes down to hindbrain. And that's one of the reasons we were talking about willpower. We only have so much of this thing, right? So we can only deal with something that we are naturally inclined to do and stop ourselves from doing it for so long before we wear out. And there's a reason why what supermarkets call the impulse items, they're all at the checkout counter, because you have to go there. Right? And they're not very expensive, and it's usually things like chocolate and candy and all of those things. And you have just gone through a shopping experience where you're probably worn out making a whole lot of choices, and that candy bar is looking really, really good right about now. That's why they put it there. So the whole idea of most diets are broken at the end of a long, hard day when you've exhausted your willpower trying to keep yourself from eating all this stuff, and the ice cream is calling to you from the fridge. The inhibition just falls off a cliff. And that's part of the reason why the guiding structure, the changing your environment, is actually what's effective at changing your behavior. Because if it's not there, you don't need inhibition. You just can't eat it.
Inhibition. Questions for reflection. How often do you rely on your ability to inhibit your initial response? Do you try to inhibit your behavior too much or not enough?
So our ability to inhibit has limitations, and that is called willpower depletion. So willpower is this way to interrupt our automatic processing in order to do something else. And our reserves of willpower are very, very limited. There's actually a huge amount of active research in cognitive psychology going on about why this appears to be true. One of the leading hypotheses is that the act of willpower actually has a physical component, which is the blood glucose levels in our brain. Over time, the more you exert willpower, the more you're burning through those reserves, and at a certain point, you have less of an ability to do that. It's a controversial area of research, lots of pros, lots of cons. Who knows how it's going to turn out? But regardless of the physiological basis, it does appear that our reserves of willpower are limited. We can't inhibit ourselves forever. And so knowing that, if you treat your willpower as a limited resource, you start making all sorts of very intelligent decisions about how to design your environment, how to design your work, in order to make it easy to do the things that you want to do, and to make it very difficult, by changing your environment, to not do the things you don't want to do. So the best way to use your limited willpower is not to use it to inhibit. You need to use it to inhibit when you really need to inhibit. It's to use your willpower to make the choice to change your environment, because you do that once. And your behavior from then on out changes automatically, because the options that are available to you in that moment change accordingly. If you treat your willpower as a depletable resource to be invested very wisely, don't rely on it. Use your willpower very tactically to make changes to your environment.
Willpower depletion. Questions for reflection. Are you relying on willpower to accomplish your goals? How can you alter your environment to require less willpower to accomplish what you set out to achieve?
Now, loss aversion is a very interesting part of psychology that we've talked about a little bit. It's the idea that people hate to lose things more than they like to gain them. And there are very few things that cognitive psychology is able to quantify. This is one of them. People hate to lose things twice as strongly as they like to gain them. So think of something like having a stock portfolio. You log in one day, and your stock portfolio is up 100%. Feels pretty good, right?
No.
Sounds like, yeah. Yeah, feels pretty good. You're feeling pretty smart right about that. Now imagine logging into your portfolio, and your portfolio is down 100%. Yes, pull yourself back from the ledge, right? The world is ending because you've lost a whole lot of something that is very valuable, or that you value very highly, right? So loss aversion is one of those things that explains why the threats to ourselves take precedence over the opportunities to gain in our lives. It goes back to our biological heritage. Not that long ago, a significant loss of resources, of influence, of status, of power could literally be a life-threatening situation. And so we hate to lose those things, and we will do almost anything we can to prevent the potential loss of that. But when you gain things, it's great, but it doesn't have that same life-ending gravity perception to it. So that's why we tend to focus on the negative stuff well and above the positive stuff. Look at the evening news. The whole news adage, if it bleeds, it leads. Because people pay attention to the risks in their environment, the scary stuff, the ways that they could potentially lose. That's coded in your mind as critical information. And loss aversion is why uncertainty appears to be so risky, right? Because if I'm starting a business, what if I spend all this time and all this money and I do all this work and nobody buys, and all of a sudden you're mentally living in a van down by the river? It's like, it's so uncertain. I don't know, I can't mentally simulate how this is going to work. So it feels very risky, and I don't want to lose, therefore I don't even try. Whereas, take a typical employment situation, it's easy to imagine, it's easy to predict, it feels stable. But when you actually look at it, you're working for one person. The decision of one person could remove all of your income in an instant, and you can't do anything about it. So that is actually a more risky situation. It doesn't feel that way. Whereas if you're selling to many customers, you can lose a customer and you can be perfectly okay. So what feels more uncertain and feels more risky and feels like you may have the higher potential of loss is actually the more secure position. So loss aversion is really, really tricky. And the best way to overcome loss aversion is to actively go back and reinterpret all of these things that you're perceiving as risky, and reinterpret all of them as no big deal. If I do it, it doesn't work out, it's no big deal. I have nothing to lose. And that is why, going back to something we talked about in the sales section, that's why risk reversal is such an important idea. Everybody suffers from loss aversion, particularly your customers. So risk reversal is the idea that if you know your customers are suffering from loss aversion, help them reinterpret the transaction as no big deal, nothing to lose. If you do that, you will make more sales. So the reason we pay attention to the news when it has a lot of negative stories in it is because, for example, if there's a story about a murder that happened across town, your brain pays attention to that because it's coded as a threat, right? So think back to the core human drives. There's a defending thing here happening. Is there something I need to do to make my family safe?
You're not any less safe than you were before knowing.
Exactly. So the news actually uses loss aversion as a means to get attention, because that's what people tend to pay attention to. Whereas you may know a pattern that if you've seen information that teenagers texting while driving are really unsafe and are likely to cause accidents, if you see one on the roadway, you're far more likely to do things like slow down, let them pass, get off the highway, and do something in response to that because you've seen a pattern.
Loss aversion. Questions for reflection. Is loss aversion holding you back from making a decision that appears to include the potential of loss? Would that loss be devastating, or could you handle it? Can you reinterpret a potential loss as no big deal?
Now, when we have the perception of impending loss, our brain tends to do something that biologically is really, really important, but in our modern business context is really counterproductive. And that's a situation called threat lockdown. So when your mind perceives a potential threat, your body immediately prepares to respond. And it goes into what is essentially a protective mode. It stops doing things like seeking opportunity. It starts paying hyper amounts of attention to threats. And it's preparing your body to take actions. This is the classic fight, flee, or freeze response. So a threat is there, your body is preparing itself to either fight off an attacker, to run away if your mind simulates that you can survive by running away instead of fighting, or if neither of those things will work, to freeze in place and just hope that the threat won't notice you and will go away. It's a very biological thing. And 100,000 years ago, that was a very constructive response, because the threats that we face on a daily basis were typically very acute: an enemy from a neighboring tribe, a predator, a natural situation that could cause us pain or injury, things like that. So they were very acute, but they were short-lived. So if you see a tiger, in 2 minutes, you are either going to be able to run away and survive, or the tiger's going to eat you, right? Or not notice you. But that situation is over in a matter of minutes. We don't deal with tigers so much anymore on a daily basis, but we do deal with angry customers, angry bosses, managers, threats of losing our job, threats of losing our status. All of these things are far less acute, but they're far more chronic. I mean, you could deal with a bad boss for years. And so we're going into biological protective mode, but that protective mode is only designed to be sustained for a very short period of time. And if you sustain it for a longer period of time, you really start doing damage to yourself, both psychologically and physically. Stress hormones are not kind on the body. And so there's a couple things in dealing with threat lockdown that are very, very helpful. The first is, if you're experiencing it, don't try to repress it. Don't try to force yourself out of it, because that's actually counterproductive, okay? It'll only make it worse. The key to dealing with it is to convince your mind of one of two things. Either the threat no longer exists, or it was never there in the first place, right? So the tiger has either moved on, or the rustling you heard in the bushes was it not actually a tiger at all, it was just the wind. And you have to do that. First, you have to notice that you're in threat lockdown. Once you do that, you have to back yourself down first. And once you back yourself down, it's far easier to say, okay, here's something that I can do to actually make the situation better. But you're not going to think along those terms until you diffuse yourself.
Threat lockdown. Questions for reflection. Are you experiencing threat lockdown right now? How quickly do you notice when you're experiencing threat lockdown? What strategies could you use to come out of threat lockdown more quickly?
How are we doing? I feel like we've reached the point of saturation. Yeah. And so we will pick up with cognitive scope limitation and go into working with yourself and working with others.